and welcome to our RTAP bi-monthly webinar series. And thank you for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Peyton, and I'm a GRA here at KUTC RTAP. Like I mentioned, please feel free to add your names and agencies to the chat box so we can all get acquainted. And in the meantime, I'll just go over some housekeeping rules before introducing the speaker. Please remember to keep yourself muted during the duration of the presentation, as there'll be a Q&A session at the end. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or write them down so that we can address them later on. I'll also be adding my email to the chat box in case you run into any technical difficulties, and feel free to reach out to me with any other concerns as well. And for today's presentation, we'll be hearing from Matt Hansen, an Associate Managing Director at Witt O'Brien's, who leads a team of over 80 grants administration and policy professionals actively providing client support to over 100 communities across the country. He is the project and technical lead for Kansas Infrastructure Hub effort, providing training and technical assistance throughout the state. And Matt is also a Kansas resident who is passionate about community needs and success. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Matt. Thank you.
All right, hopefully I have hit all the right buttons and you're able to see my screen all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity. Before we get started, I just want to make everybody aware this is not a consultant sales pitch. Yes, I do work for Witt O'Brien's, but we are under contract with the Kansas Infrastructure Hub and the Kansas Department of Transportation. So everything we talk about today is a resource that the state has already invested in and is available to you. So a lot of this information is out there already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the slides. I'm going to move through them pretty quickly to leave as much time for question and answer at the end of the session. So first and foremost, the Kansas Infrastructure Hub is live. In the chat, I put the web address kshub.org. The Build Kansas Fund, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, the $200 million is available for a local match. So as you are pursuing grants that are in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there is the Build Kansas Fund, $200 million in local match available, and I'll talk a little bit about the process for accessing that. We are really excited that to date, there have been about $56 million worth of projects that have accessed the Build Kansas Fund. They are waiting on final decisions from the federal grantors, but really excited, that we're well on our way to having that $200 million in local match, leveraging or securing, bringing down as much as $1 billion in federal funding. And that's really the goal of this, is how we can invest state of Kansas general fund to bring additional federal dollars into the state. So today, just going to talk a little bit about BIL, talk about the hub, introduce you to the capacity extension team, talk a little bit about risk and opportunities, and then leave some time for Q&A at the end. So first and foremost, what is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law? It is arguably, one of the largest investments of federal funds that we've seen. My career in federal grants goes back to '94, where we had the Crime Act. At that time, we thought we saw historic amounts of money. Then Katrina, Rita, 9/11, housing crisis, COVID. Every time we turn around, it seems like we're setting a new bar for historic amounts of federal money. But the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is a $1.2 trillion investment. So really remarkable opportunities. Just for clarity's sake, you will hear BIL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Infrastructure Bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. They are all referring to the same thing. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, was the name of the legislation when it was being considered by Congress. when it was signed by the president, it was signed into law as the BIL, or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So we've had some conversations where people have made statements like, well, if there's funding, not available in the BIL, is there funding available in the IIJ? And you're talking about the same package. Today's conversation will be limited to the infrastructure bill. That's really, per the state legislation. That's the scope of the hub. That's the scope of the Build Kansas Fund. But I just want to make sure everybody's aware that there's also, two other massive funding packages out there. One is the Inflation Reduction Act, and one is the CHIPS and Science Act. And depending on which sectors you're in, there's opportunities in all three sectors. As an example, energy, you'll see grants in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. You'll see tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, and you'll see apprenticeship and other dollars in the CHIPS and Science Act. So really some interesting opportunities to cobble funding together. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as I mentioned, $1.2 million across 5 years. We are in year 2. Year 3 of the bill is actually the high watermark from an appropriations perspective, before things will start to level out or come down a little bit in years 4 and 5. While we are not expecting the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to be extended as a package, we are anticipating that most, if not all, programs that make up the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will be continued after the 5 years. Programs like the revolving loan programs from EPA and BRIC and RAISE and Safe Streets for All, those programs existed before BIL, and they will certainly exist after BIL. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is almost 400 programs across 12 federal agencies. There is within that 6 primary sectors, the largest sector being transportation, but there is also water, energy, broadband, cybersecurity, and the 6th sector, which is resiliency, which is a cross-cutting sector that has a lot of interesting programs like BRIC, building resilient infrastructure, flood mitigation, and some other programs that you would normally only see after a disaster event, being funded before a disaster event, so you could proactively address some issues. 60% of the money is formulaic, meaning it will go through a state agency and then be subawarded to local governments, local entities. The revolving loan programs for water and wastewater are examples of that. Much of the broadband money will be formulaic. But the really exciting thing is 40% of it is discretionary and competitive, meaning local governments, local communities can apply directly to the federal government without having to go through the state, without having to go through a regional planning commission. You can apply directly. And we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies to be as competitive as possible when going directly to the federal government for these discretionary opportunities. The Kansas Infrastructure Hub is a state working group. It is administratively located at KDOT, but it is not a KDOT function. In state government, everything's got to live someplace, and that's where they allowed the Kansas Infrastructure Hub to live. The transportation is obviously the largest sector of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, so made a lot of sense for it to be located there. The other sub-cabinet agencies that are involved are the Department of Commerce, in particular because of the Kansas Office of Broadband Development, which is located in Commerce. The water component of KDHE. There's also a role for the air quality component of KDHE. Ag, not really the Department of Administration anymore, but OITS, that's where the cybersecurity function lives in state government. The Corporation Commission, as I'm sure many of you know, the state of Kansas doesn't have a traditional energy office, so energy funding flows through the Corporation Commission. and then the water office. There are also some other, the water cabinet and some other entities that participate, but they're not sort of formal members of the sub-cabinet. So 2 summers ago, a summit was held to talk about what the state would need with the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And during that summit, the message was loud and clear that in order to be successful, local governments needed 2 things. One is local cost share, the local match, that local governments would not have the resources to come up with that, or if they did come up with it, they wouldn't be able to come up with it in a timely fashion. And the other was grant support. A lot of communities, organizations, either don't have their own grants capacity, or they work through a regional planning commission or some other partner. And based on the size and scope of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there just wasn't going to be enough grants capacity to go around in the state. All of this coming on the heels of COVID and ARPA fatigue, where people had been, managing the CARES Act and ARPA funding for the last 3 years, and were sort of burned out from a grants capacity. So really needed to find some additional resources to help support that. Those messages were heard loud and clear, and the legislature, along with the governor's office, passed a piece of legislation that allocated $215 million in state general fund dollars to support these activities. Of that $215 million, $5 million annually is to support the hub and the grant training capacity development work of the capacity extension team that I'll talk about a little bit later. The other $200 million was to set up this match leverage fund, or the Build Kansas Fund. The $200 million is roughly allocated $50 million a year for 4 years. But the way the legislation was written, if $50 million is not used in year 1, it is not lost. It can be pushed into out years. And if more than $50 million is needed in year 1, year 2, money can be advanced. There are very few restrictions to the Build Kansas Fund dollars. But one of the restrictions is that at the end of the 4-year period, each of the state's economic development districts must have received at least $10 million worth of investment from the Build Kansas Fund. And this was really to ensure geographic equity, and that the larger metropolitan areas like Sedgwick and Johnson County and a few others didn't consume the entire $200 million. So at the end of the 4 years, Southwest Kansas will get a minimum of $10 million. Northwest Kansas will get a minimum of $10 million, et cetera. So this 2-pronged approach is really hoping to take the barriers away, to take the excuses away, to provide the resources that communities across the state need to successfully navigate the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Again, the $200 million is not a discretionary pot of money to fund projects like with the Spark process or the BASE process that we saw under ARPA. The purpose of the $200 million is to leverage or match federal dollars. So the goal here is that $200 million will bring down $1 billion plus in federal funds. And to just highlight how important that is, the Kansas Water Office just recently put out a grant program for water projects. They had $17 million available. They got 300 applications totaling $380 million. So just to highlight, there is not enough funding at the state level or local level to address all these issues. If we're going to close that gap, close that delta at all, it's really going to take leveraging these federal dollars. And I'm talking ahead of my slides, but again, the goal is, this was a very conservative 800 million. The goal is $1 billion plus. And to be quite transparent, the bipartisan infrastructure law was not written or designed for states like Kansas. With things like the Justice 40 initiative and a focus on, more urban areas, it really wasn't intended, that a bulk of the funding would wind up in more rural states, more Midwestern states like Kansas. So we really have to think outside the box on how we can, best navigate that and pull down these dollars. It is really unprecedented what the state of Kansas is doing. There are quite a few states that have infrastructure hubs, but they might have the training TA piece, but not the local cost share, or they might have the match, but not the training TA. And in those states where they have a matching fund, the matching fund is 25 million or 30 million. No one is doing it at a scale of Kansas with a $200 million matching fund. So this is an eye chart, and we certainly will make the slides available afterwards. But just really quickly to let you know how the process would work. So you identify a project, you align that project with a potential federal bipartisan infrastructure law opportunity. You do the scope, and you're like, okay, our project's $1 million. It has a 10% match requirement, so I have to come up with $100,000 in match, and I'm using overly simple example and round numbers. So what you would do at that point is you would submit a Build Kansas Fund application. It is a streamlined application. It should take no more than 5 or 10 minutes to submit that application. That application will go to the sub cabinet for review, and ultimately you'll receive a letter that says your match allocation has been allocated, has been awarded, and you can include that letter in your federal grant application. That money will sit there encumbered for you until you get a funding decision from the federal government. If it is a positive funding decision, then you'll get a formal grant agreement, and that money will be distributed to you. If for whatever reason you're not awarded the federal opportunity, that money will be released back into the Build Kansas Fund to be used for other projects. Like I said earlier, we've actually had approvals of 62 million. One of the projects was not funded. It had a match requirement of 10 million. That 10 million has gone back into the fund. So currently there is $52 million from the Build Kansas Fund that's been committed to projects, waiting on the federal agencies to make funding decisions. To date, we've only had 2 projects that have gone all the way through the process and been awarded by the federal government. Couple notes. The infrastructure hub is not selecting projects. This isn't a merit competition like Spark, like BASE. They're not comparing a transit project to a water project and deciding which one has more merit. If you're applying for a federal BIL opportunity and it has a match requirement and you apply for Build Kansas funds, it will be awarded. So this isn't competitive. This is local match or the state providing your local match. Everything I've talked about today, will talk about today, is intended to be additive. If you have your source of local match, that's great. If you have grants capacity, that's great. If you're working with a firm, you're working with K-State Extension, you're working with a regional planning commission, you're working with whomever, that's great. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you need additional help and don't know where to turn, that's where these resources are available, both the matching funds and the capacity extension team. So the capacity extension team is intended to be the project development grant research pursuance resource. We have aligned the regions to the regional planning commissions or the EDDs. To the best of our ability, we are looking to coordinate with the regional planning commissions and their staff. Some of them are much more effective, much more involved in grants than others. So it's a little bit of hit or miss. Where there is no regional planning commission, like the Region 4 on this map, or where there's regional planning commissions that might have less capacity, we're also trying to work through chambers of commerce, local economic development authorities, and even reaching out to city and county staff directly. We will, again, the slide will be made available to you, but the capacity extension team, there is a representative assigned to each of those regions. They should be your go-to person when you're trying to figure out if a project is appropriate for a federal grant, what funding opportunities are out there, how to navigate the Build Kansas Fund application, anything you need from a grants management capacity, these folks are available to you. I'm gonna get on my soapbox a little bit. As we've been traveling around the state, we hear a lot of folks who have sort of talked themselves out of pursuing BIL opportunities. They're too small, they're too rural, they don't have the right demographics. Justice 40 is going to skew the money elsewhere. So these are the perceived risk that we keep hearing. I've never done a federal grant before, I'll make a mistake. I'm going to tell everybody I'm going after this grant, and then I will disappoint my leadership if we're not successful. A lot of, coming out of ARPA and COVID, a lot of the grant fatigue. My other duties won't get done. I can't spend any more time on grants. It's a waste of time. We will never get awarded. And I just want to, quickly, if it's a good project, the grantor will work with you to correct any omissions or errors in the application. Your other duties will be always there. The grant opportunities will not. Year 3 of the build of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is the high watermark from the appropriations perspective, and we have a $200 million matching fund. What that means is you really have an 18-month to 2-year window of opportunity to really move the needle from a grants management perspective. The last one, it's a waste of time, we'll never get awarded. Well, the first 2 grant awards to the state of Kansas were to the city of Ozaukee, population 638. It is really sort of unprecedented, where we're seeing federal grants being awarded, how many federal grants, programs like RAISE or Safe Streets for All. It used to be the state of Kansas would be lucky to get 6 to 8 of those grant awards. 2 years ago, it went up to mid-teens. Last year it was low 20s. This year we're actually thinking it could be 30 to 40. For a state like Kansas to get 30 to 40 Safe Street for All grant awards, or that many RAISE grant awards, is really incredible, and just tells you, how big of an opportunity there is right now. The real risk in when it comes to this funding are thinking too small, too local. Historically with grants, we tried to, narrow our scope, narrow our focus, make sure our grant fit into a very small box, sharpened our pencil to reduce our ask. And that was a good thought process. That worked well. It doesn't, however, work well with the bipartisan infrastructure law. They're wanting big, needle moving projects. They're wanting regionalism. They're wanting cities and counties working together, counties working together. They're wanting, non-traditional partners collaborating, and they want projects that are all inclusive, that, a traffic calming project also includes bike lanes and sidewalks and ADA handicap ramps and linear park and flood retention basin and everything you can imagine. That's the type of projects they're looking at. Sleeping on resiliency funding in Kansas, the resiliency funding is really thought of as, the green energy environment and some other things. We really should be thinking about the resiliency funding in Kansas as adding additional capacity, adding redundancy to our communities. Hardening our electrical grids, uh, putting in additional broadband fiber. So if one fiber line gets cut, not relying on a single bridge and a low water crossing, but converting the second low water crossing to another bridge. Thinking about it, really adding that additional capacity to our communities. For a lot of smaller jurisdictions, they have historically only ever looked at state pass-through dollars. Certainly, there are huge opportunities there. That's where 60% of the money. But that 40% that you can apply for directly is huge, and you shouldn't miss out on that. Limiting partnerships, again, think outside the box. Think, there might be a community that you're not geographically located next to that has a lot in common with your community, and you could do a pilot project in both jurisdictions, even if they're on, one is in Leavenworth and the other one is in Greensburg, as far apart in Kansas as you can get. But if they're similar interests, similar projects, those are type of non-traditional partnerships they're looking for. Focusing on lights on activities. As we have these trainings and meetings, there are a lot of folks who, you have the items you're trying to address right in front of you. They're the, water mains that are broken, or, roads that need to be, repaired, those sort of things. Those are the issues that citizens are calling about. They're the things that keep elected leaders up at night trying to solve. If we can address some of those through these grant opportunities, great. But don't only focus on lights on activities. Also think about the bigger opportunities. That's maybe a project that's 2 or 3 or 4 years down your to-do list that can be advanced because the opportunity that is BIL and the Build Kansas Fund. And then finally, the real risk is kicking the can down the road and doing nothing. Again, I've been doing federal grants for 30 years, and I've never seen an environment we're in right now from a federal perspective, let alone when you add in the $200 million matching fund from the state of Kansas. So again, more so kind of lessons learned. A lot of people were saying, I need a grant writer, I need a grant writer. Really being successful in grants is aligning the right project with the right opportunity. To add on to that a little bit, thinking outside the box and nibbling around the edges. An example I like to use is there was a community that needed to upgrade the electrical service to their city hall, and they needed to rewire the city hall. And so they wanted to talk to us about what grant opportunities that were available for renovating the city hall. There are almost 400 grant opportunities in the BIL. Unfortunately, there is not the Renovate City Hall grant opportunity. So then we had to get creative. And one of the things we came up with is the electric vehicle grant program. This community had absolutely no interest in electric vehicle charging. It was, the furthest thing from, anything they wanted to do. And we had to explain to them, if you put, electric vehicle recharging spots in front of City Hall, as part of that project, you would have to upgrade the electrical service and rewire parts of City Hall. So even though you didn't necessarily want EV charging spots, it was a way to get what you ultimately were trying to accomplish, which was to upgrade to City Hall. One of the other lessons learned is grant writing is only a very small component of the overall grant research and pursuance process. We have lots of people that have a problem or they have an idea and they haven't advanced that specific project far enough to get to the actual grant writing spot. So we want to connect homeowners who are currently on a septic system to a sewage treatment plant. Well, whose sewage treatment plant are you going to connect them to? Or are you going to, build something new or do a wastewater lagoon? Or, they haven't thought through those particulars. And those particulars are critical because you're potentially going to have land acquisition, permitting, right-of-ways, budget estimates, preliminary engineering, and all of those things are, part of most federal grant applications. So really trying to, work with folks to move projects along. Maybe they're not ready for a grant application this year, but again, this is a 5-year program, so they, hopefully could be ready next year or the year after. Go home, go big or go home. I talked about this earlier. They are looking for, people who are thinking outside the box, people who are thinking, big vision, strategic, needle movers. And finally, collaborations and partnerships are critical. So the more you are working together, working with your neighboring entities, jurisdictions, ultimately the more successful you're going to be at the federal level. The last 2 slides, really quickly, I want to talk about is, don't let the notices of funding opportunity, notices of funding availability sort of shut down, your thinking, your ideas. As I'm sure most people on this call, federal NOFOs are 50, 70, 100 pages long, full of government language. And so the RAISE grant, which is a transportation grant, which is open right now, it closes at the end of the month. If you open up that NOFO and you read through the allowability, you'll see, projects under Title 23 U.S. Code, Chapter 53, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you could very quickly go through here and say, not for me, no opportunity, this doesn't align with the projects I need to do, I want to do. But the last bullet is actually the most informative bullet. Any other project that the Secretary of Transportation considers to be necessary to advance the goals of the program, which basically says the Secretary can fund whatever he wants. And if you go to, when you see one of these NOFOs and you go to award announcements from previous years, it really gives you some insight into what the opportunity could be. So if you go to the 2023 grant awards for the RAISE program, and there are several hundred grant awards, and suddenly you see things like revitalizing main streets, trails, bridges, downtown mobility, historic preservation, arts, culture, tourism, economic development. Those items all look very different than these items. So, don't let the NOFO, stop you from thinking big, stop you from thinking outside the box. I really encourage you to look at previous grant awards to see what types of projects were funded. Reach out to the capacity extension team member and we can talk, through potential opportunities with you. We also have an ability to get copies of previously funded applications, which are also very enlightening as to, how much work or how little work would have to go into developing an application and what types of items have been funded previously. So with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for any questions you all might have.
I don't want to, if anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt me, but I was curious, do you have an example of like an entity or jurisdiction you've worked with in Kansas already that's done a grant submission that's been a partnership with someone else?
Uh, yeah, we certainly have. There's a project in Dodge City, which is involving a major economic, a major business in the community, as well as the surrounding counties, as well as some different water authorities. So it's public-private partnership as well as multiple government entities involved. Um, uh, this particular project actually would have impact across not only the state but the region, as it involves aquifer recharge into the Northern Plains aquifer. So it would affect communities, all throughout Western Kansas and into Nebraska and other states. So that's an extreme example, but it's also a good one. We have uh, there's a program called the Grid Resiliency Program. It's an energy electrical program where we see lots of um, uh, utility companies working with local cities, local counties on joint projects. So a lot of opportunities out there.
Can you share why the one area that doesn't have an economic development district, Topeka? I'm in Nemaha County. I don't understand why the state capital isn't part of an economic development district.
It's in an economic development district. That's a federal EDA designation. There is not a regional planning commission that serves that area.
So who can we refer to at the federal level?
So for purposes of the Build Kansas Fund and the grant opportunities, you can refer to Jen Colton, or Jen, is it you? Or no, it's
I've been handling the Topeka region, so
Yeah.
you can feel free to reach out to me directly.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome. And I dropped my email into the chat and we'll circulate the slides so everyone has each of the capacity extension team members.
I was also wondering, are there opportunities for bill grants that are like across different sectors?
There are, and that's one of the things we're really advocating for. I was in Comanche County earlier this week, and you had one participant who was very focused on water mains and water lines and fire hydrants, and you had another participant who was, wanting to, do pavement preservation and restoration of roadways. And you had another person who was talking about mobility and ADA compliance. And they were all thinking about like that they were doing separate projects and separate grants. And I was trying to communicate saying, no, that's one project. It's, and none of these projects should leave a negative impact on the community. So a lot of communities are seeing, conduit or fiber being run for broadband purposes. When they cut for that, they trench for that, they impact sidewalks, they impact roadways, they impact other utilities. All of those grants should pay for the complete restoration of anything they impact. So from a federal perspective, from a competitiveness perspective, where you have a project that touches on multiple sectors, by far are going to be the most competitive opportunities out there. Another one is flood mitigation. Flood mitigation is usually a project where we only see funding for it after an incident, after a disaster. There's flood mitigation money available, and talk to a lot of people about, you're looking to upgrade roads, you're looking to upgrade sidewalks, but are there areas that need new culverts, drainage ditches, retention ponds, low water crossings, you name it. So address it as much from a flood mitigation, prevention perspective as you are from a roadway preservation perspective.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no questions, I want to thank you for speaking with us, Matt. That was really great. And I want to remind everybody here that we will be posting this on our YouTube channel so that you can refer back to it later. But I believe, like Jennifer said, we will be getting a copy of the presentation as well. So feel free to email us about that. Yeah, and don't be afraid to contact them in regards to questions about grants. Thank you guys so much for speaking with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you, Peyton. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.